Good evening, Rowan. It's the 23rd of January 2016 and it's just before 5 in the morning, so we're still in the Madrugada, and I'm going to be talking today about a talk that you gave called Sexuality, Sexual Health and Religion Today, and you gave this lecture on the 21st of July 2015 at the Royal College of Medicine. And it's a truly bizarre lecture, as most of yours are, but I'm just going to comment on a little bit of it today, and I'll comment on the rest of it on future occasions. So, I'll have to be quick though, won't I, because you'll be having your Dietrich Bonhoeffer moment, won't you? And also, of course, I want to reassure you I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend. And obviously it wouldn't be you, even if I was. And I do want to remind the world at large, while we're on the subject of sexuality, sexual health and religion today, that you tried to get your penis in my vagina. This was while you were already married, and this was while you were the bishop and I was a prospective ordinand. So you were trying to get me on that there casting couch in your front room, weren't you? And you wanted to bring me under your control, and sexually dominating me was one of the ways that you were going to do that. I mean, you're a very lustful man anyway, but you wanted to possess me sexually as a kind of inroad into possessing me in other ways, so you could bring me under your control, then you would ordain me, and then you could control me to spout the same globalist bullshit that you always come out with. So on that note, I'll move on quickly to the things that you say. So, you redefine sexual health to mean sexual well-being. And then you go on to say that this well-being is an accentuated or deepened sense in our culture, generally of our sexuality as an area where damage can be done, where humanity can be either nourished or abused in various ways. So I'm just going to talk about you defining this as a cultural sense, really, something that's culturally defined. It's not an objective reality. This is relativism. It has its roots in Marxism, really, that culture defines things that are actually biologically determined, like sexual behaviour, for example, and sexual desire. So you talk about sexuality being an area where damage can be done, where humanity can be either nourished or abused in various ways, but the only reason this is so, that it can be damaging, is because there is a sense of that in our culture. It's not an objective reality. So rape isn't objectively wrong or objectively traumatic. It's only because we've got a cultural sense that it is. Right, well, I suppose that gets you off the hook then, doesn't it? And the notion that we take responsibility for our well-being in the area of our sexuality is something that has come rather more into focus, I suppose, because of that broader cultural sense that this is an area where damage is possible, where damage to oneself is possible, and there are lots of complicated facts we have to come to terms with in order to secure something like well-being. So you're reiterating here that this is all, the setting of this is a cultural sense, really. Well, of course, there are cultural and religious values around sex. You're supposed to be talking about religion, but you don't actually mention it very much at all. It's just your usual flannel and self-interested self-justification, bombastic self-justification. The only reason that people are wounded by sexual harassment and abuse is because they've been culturally conditioned to feel that way. It's not objectively wrong to sexually abuse people or harass them or go around slandering them behind the back or anything like that. It only feels wrong because we've been culturally conditioned to feel that way. Right. In a broader cultural sense, that this is an area where damage is possible, where damage to oneself is possible, and there are lots of complicated facts we have to come to terms with in order to secure something like well-being. Well, you just carry on worrying about yourself, Rowan, that your sexual behaviour might cause damage to yourself. Don't worry about all the damage that you've caused to me, will you? Or all the other people that you've victimised. Don't worry about the damage to me that's been caused by your perverted astrophysical clergy friend. Don't worry about that. You just worry about whether you cause any damage to yourself or not, because after all, the universe revolves around you, and you're the only one who's of any significance, aren't you? And you say there's lots of complicated facts we have to come to terms with in order to secure something like well-being. Well, there aren't a lot of complicated facts, to be honest, Rowan. It's very uncomplicated. I don't want your penis in my vagina, and I don't want you threatening to kill me because you haven't got what you wanted out of me, and I won't flatter you, and I won't stop saying that you're a scumbag. It's very simple, Rowan. I am the victim, you are the abuser. It's very simple. It's not complicated at all. There are no nuances. It's not in the slightest bit complicated. You are the abuser, I am the victim. You go on to talk about our sexual behaviour and imagining, our fantasies and fears, our desires in this area are so much bound up, not just with myself as a body, but with all kinds of interrelationships of meaning and power. And those two words, meaning and power, are going to be very much in my mind as I reflect this evening. So, you've turned up to talk to the Royal Society of Medicine, so that's a bunch of people that are mostly doctors probably, and are all adults certainly, and you've come up to inform them of this profound insight that you have, that sexual behaviour involves interrelationships. It's relational. It doesn't just involve you as a body, it's interrelational. Well, I just don't even know what to say about that. You're completely crazy. So you go on to say, what we fear, what we turn away from, often condemn, as in the case of paedophilia, is sexual behaviour that involves the abuse of power. So this is more relativism, really, isn't it? That paedophilia, you're not defining as objectively wrong. Abusing children, you're not defining as objectively wrong. It's only because we fear it, we turn away from it, and we condemn it. So this is more cultural relativism, really. You can't say that sexually abusing people is wrong. You've got to put it in a cultural context to justify yourself, because you can't say that sexual abuse is objectively wrong because you take part in it. I'm not talking about paedophilia, but forcing yourself on adults who don't want you is wrong as well. We shrink from, or we think unhealthy or irregular or intolerable kinds of sexual behaviour or sexual relation where there is deep imbalance of power and of meaning, where one person has the kind of power over another that leaves the other with no liberty, no agency to say who they are and what they mean. And then you make a bizarre gesture with your glasses to say that this isn't the case in relation to me. But it is the case, Rowan, because I've got no liberty and no agency to say who I am and what I mean in relation to you, because all you ever do is blame me for criticising you for your abusive behaviour, and you've tried to force yourself on me and get your perverted friends to force themselves on me. So don't be telling me that there's no imbalance of power and that this isn't the case, because you completely you tried to completely wreck my life. You went everywhere, hounded me round from town to town for over a decade. So don't tell me there's no imbalance of power when you weren't even doing it to my face. You were lying your bastard face off behind my back. Don't tell me there's no imbalance of power when you're pouncing around in the House of Lords with your fancy dress on and posing on church occasions as well, and having yourself presented in the media and in the church as some kind of spiritual guru and genius and exceptionally holy man. So don't be telling me there's no imbalance of power, you lying little toad. We shrink from, or we think unhealthy or irregular or intolerable kinds of sexual behaviour or sexual relation where there is deep imbalance of power and of meaning, where one person has the kind of power over another that leaves the other with no liberty or agency to say who they are or what they mean. So you're defining this in a relativist way as well, talking about shrinking from it. You don't shrink from it anyway, you force yourself on people. At least you've tried to force yourself on me. You're just a disgusting pervert. You really are. You're obsessed with sex. You're absolutely obsessed with it. You read it into situations where it doesn't exist. You spend all of your time fantasising about it, and you can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality. You think if you're fantasising that some woman's having lesbian affairs just because that titillates you, you think then it must be true, and especially if she didn't fancy you and make her vagina available to you so that you could be inserting your penis in it, which is what you spend a lot of time fantasising about, isn't it, Rowan? So you go on to say, and so we're very wary, and rightly wary, of these behaviour and relationships which deprive people of their agency or which represent power at its most malign. Well, I think you're protesting too much, Rowan, because you've said the same thing now 3 times in different ways, but also, as I've said, defining sexual morality in relation particularly to not forcing people who are not interested. You've defined it 3 times in relativist terms. You didn't need to say it 3 times, you could have said it once in non-relativist terms. So this is an issue for you here, and it's more shifty footwork, because you can't ever admit that you're wrong, can you? And I'm sure I'm not the only person you've been trying to coerce, and you probably had some success with other people, but you're never going to have any success with me. I don't wish to have your penis in my vagina. Thank you. As soon as we've said that the distortions of meaning, the claim to tell somebody else who they are and what they mean, our sexual behaviour is bound up with communication and consent, and then you say a little bit later on, human beings negotiating. So actually you've said the same thing 4 times in relativist terms, and you're now defining human beings, at least 2 human beings, if they're together, embark on a sexual relationship, you've defined that as negotiating. Well, I've never heard it put that quite that way before. You make it sound like a business transaction. Well, I mean, I'm sure you've been negotiating prices with sex workers, so that's probably what's in your mind. Anyway, you then go on to talk about consent workshops at Cambridge University, where you're working at the moment, and you say this is important. I just think it's completely ridiculous, to be honest. It's hard to imagine that there are circumstances in which someone doesn't know whether another person is consenting or not. And I suppose, you know, if one person's drunk, then they can't consent, then that would affect the issue. So I just thought this was something that parents would teach their children, really. Don't force people to have sex with you, and don't get people drunk or drug them so that they won't be able to consent in an informed way, so that you can coerce them more easily, or even so much so that they may not know what's even happening to them. So consent workshops, I just think they're quite bizarre. Everybody knows whether somebody's consenting or not. It's just a gimmick. That word consent and what goes with it, and the notion of what we want to communicate to one another in sexual behaviour, that's one of the things that makes our sexual behaviour, our sexual lives, that little bit more complicated than just one of the many things we do as bodies. And then you go on to compare it to eating, and you say eating can be given many meanings, and sharing a meal is preferable to baked beans on toast alone. But we don't so much feel that issue of power and meaning are quite so much involved. Well, I mean, it's an assumption that sharing a meal is preferable to eating alone, because it depends on the circumstances of who you're eating with, doesn't it? If you don't like someone, or you find them objectionable, like I find you objectionable, I would certainly not want to be sharing a meal with you, and I would far rather eat alone. So it does depend on the circumstances. And also, it depends on the circumstances when you're considering whether you want to engage in sex with someone as well. And if you're a Christian with traditional values, then you wouldn't want to be engaging in sex with someone that you're not married to. But even assuming that that wasn't the case, and that you were happy to have sex with certain people, either of a different sex or of the same sex as you, then you wouldn't want that being forced on you, would you? You'd want to have a choice about it. So even if you consent to sex with some people, that doesn't mean you consent to sex with everybody. And also, when you consider eating a meal as well, it's not quite equivalent, is it? Because what you've tried to do to me, really, is force me to eat the meal with you. So it's not like I would be choosing to eat a meal with you. You've wanted to force me into relationship with you. You don't recognise that I've got the freedom of association. I've certainly got the freedom and the right to refuse to have sex with you, but I've also got the right to refuse to have a meal with you as well, because I don't want to associate with you. So although the two things are different, there are similarities between them, in that you don't want to really be forced to do anything, do you? Well, I certainly don't. And I'm certainly not going to be forced into anything by a sleazy, psychopathic scumbag like you. And then you go on to say, I've had to put another word in this sentence to abbreviate it a bit. You can't disentangle sex, culturally speaking, from these issues of power, mutuality and communication. So you're defining it culturally as well. Again here, I mean, yes, well, culture and religion do have a relevance when you're talking about the norms of sexual behaviour, but generally speaking, people don't like being forced into relationships that they don't want, and being forced into sexual activity that they don't want. and being forced to listen to dirty, disgusting old men who happen to be alcoholics as well, and who are supposed to be taking care of you because they're a member of clergy and you're a member of the parish. You don't want to be listening to them saying things to you like, "I like it hot and sweet," while they're looking at you in a leery way, and "oh, lusty, yes, very lusty," while leering in your face. So you don't want things like that, do you? Well, I don't anyway, and this is what I had to put up with, and this is what you punished me for complaining about. So you can keep on with all the shifty footwork about power and agency and meaning and so on, but the simple fact is, you and your perverted colleague tried to force themselves on me. In fact, two of your perverted colleagues tried to force themselves on me, and one of them actually sexually assaulted me. So don't be bothering giving fancy lectures full of bombastic self-justification about power and agency, just to avoid using the plain English that it is wrong to force people into sex when they don't want it, and it's also wrong to try and force people to associate with you when they don't want that either. So I'll leave that there for now, but I have more to say about this video, which goes from bizarre to bizarre, and I shall be reassuring you on Sunday that I haven't been seducing any priests over the weekend. And as I mentioned before, even if I was going to be seducing any priests over the weekend, it wouldn't be a sleazy, dirty, psychopathic scumbag like you. I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire. So have a nice weekend, and I shall be speaking to you again on Sunday. Hasta la próxima.
Begin with the very term, sexual health. Ask what exactly we mean by that, and how much we include within that. It's in some ways a very modern term. I dare say that if you had looked at textbooks and discussions 100 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago, sexual health as a concept in itself probably wouldn't have figured all that largely. But there it is now, quite clearly, something that is taken seriously in our discourse about health and healing, and that I think reflects what's probably an accentuated or deepened sense in our culture generally of our sexuality as an area where damage can be done, where humanity can be either nourished or abused in various ways. And the notion that we take responsibility for our well-being in the area of our sexuality is something which has come rather more into focus, I suppose partly because of that broader cultural sense that this is an area where damage is possible, where damage to oneself is possible, and where there are lots of complicated factors that we have to come to terms with in order to secure something like well-being. Of course, I use that word well-being because anybody talking about health these days will have to be reminded or remind themselves pretty regularly that health is something other than the absence of disease. Just as peace is more than the absence of war, so health is a great deal more than not actually having to go to the doctor. And so that's why I'm talking about well-being in this context. And that's why I begin with that question, what do we mean by sexual well-being? There will be all kinds of answers to that, and there are some very brief and practical ones, some rather more complicated and philosophical ones. I'll try and steer a good hanging and middle course there. But I want to begin thinking about that just with a reminder about why this might be complicated. And I suppose in a nutshell, what's in my mind is that our sexual behavior of imagining, our fantasies and fears, our aspirations and desires are so much bound up, not just with myself as a body, but with all kinds of interrelationships of meaning and of power. Those two words, meaning and power, are going to be very much in my mind as I reflect this evening. What we fear, what we turn away from, often condemn, as in the case of paedophilia, is sexual behaviour that involves the abuse of power. We shrink from, we think, unhealthy or irregular or intolerable kinds of sexual behaviour and sexual relation where there is a deep imbalance of power and of meaning. Where one person has the kind of power over another that leaves the other with no agency, no liberty to say who they are, what they mean. And so we're very wary, rightly wary, of those behaviours and relationships which deprive people of their agency, which represent power at its most malign. But as soon as we've said that sexuality is bound up with power and meaning, and that the distortions of sexual behaviour and practice have something to do with abuses of power and distortions of meaning, claim to tell somebody else who they are and what they mean, and so forth. Since we've said that, we recognise that our sexual behaviour is always in some way or another seems bound up with communication and consent, all those things which have to do with human beings negotiating with one another. In my college at Cambridge, we now have a workshop every year for new students on consent, because we're deeply, painfully aware that that's one of the issues they're going to have to think about very, very hard, monitor themselves as they come to this new and unfamiliar world. And that word, consent, goes with it, and the notion of what we want to communicate to one another in sexual behaviour. That's one of the things that makes our sexual behaviour, our sexual lives, that little bit more complicated from just one of the many things we do as bodies. We can talk about other bodily functions in rather less loaded ways. Eating can be given quite a lot of meanings. Sharing a meal is, in many ways, preferable to baked beans on toasted bone. But we don't somehow feel that issues of power and meaning are quite so much involved with our lives as eaters. Here is another very basic set of bodily functions, bodily relations, activities, where you can't ever quite, it seems, disentangle it, helpfully speaking, from these questions about power, mutuality, communication. So, I suppose one of the questions that we're always bound at some point to be asking and thinking about sexuality and sexual well-being is, with any sexual activity, what do I mean by this? What do I actually want to say? You can imagine someone cynically responding and saying, what I want to say is that I want sexual pleasure. That's it. The fact is that there is, as I've suggested, no way of completely disentangling what we do with another person from those issues of our power and therefore meaning. So what do I want to say? What do I mean here? And that suggests, of course, that ultimately sexual well-being is not just a matter of achieving a good physical equilibrium. It's about a particular kind of integrity.